The room was silent except for the low hum of the fluorescent lights. A woman in a beige prison uniform sat quietly, her eyes fixed on the clock as the seconds ticked toward 9:13 p.m. She whispered her final words, an apology to the daughter of the man she'd helped kill. Minutes later, the needle entered her arm. When the monitor flatlined, history was made. Teresa Wilson Bean Lewis became the first woman in nearly a century to be executed in Virginia, and the last ever to face the death chamber in that state. But behind her final words of sorrow lay a story that blurred the line between evil and manipulation, between justice and tragedy. To understand how a small-town woman from Danville, Virginia, ended up strapped to a gurney in 2010, we have to go back, decades before the night of the murders, to the broken beginnings of Teresa's life. Teresa Wilson was born on April 26, 1969, in the rural city of Danville, Virginia, a place defined by textile mills, small churches, and quiet poverty. Her parents were hard-working mill laborers, and from an early age, Teresa was known as a shy girl with a soft singing voice. On Sundays, she sang hymns in the local church choir, where the community often praised her for her kindness and innocence. But behind closed doors, Teresa's life wasn't as simple as it seemed. Poverty pressed hard on the family, and as she grew into her teenage years, Teresa longed for something more. Security, affection, a place where she truly belonged. At 16, she dropped out of school and married a man she'd met through the church. Soon after, she had her only child, a daughter named Christy. But the marriage quickly fell apart. Her husband left, and Teresa was thrust into a life of instability. She turned to alcohol and painkillers to cope, numbing the loneliness and rejection that seemed to follow her. Those who knew her described her as fragile, sometimes sweet, sometimes lost, and often confused. Her mother-in-law would later tell investigators, Teresa just wasn't right. Something about her never was. For years, Teresa drifted from one low-paying job to another, moving through life like a shadow. Then, one spring day in 2000, she walked into the Dan River textile mill and met the man who would change everything. His name was Julian Clifton Lewis, Jr., a 51-year-old widower and supervisor at the mill. Julian had lost his wife a few years ago and was raising 3 children alone, Jason, Charles, and Kathy. He was respected, steady, and deeply devoted to his family. Teresa, by contrast, was adrift. She was looking for a place to land, and Julian seemed like the answer. By the summer of 2000, Teresa and her teenage daughter Christy had moved into Julian's home. They married soon after. For the first time in years, Teresa had stability, a roof over her head, a husband who cared for her, and a family to belong to. But beneath that comfort, something darker was brewing. In December 2001, tragedy struck. Julian's oldest son, Jason, was killed in a car crash. His death devastated the family. Julian received a $200,000 life insurance payout from Jason's policy, money he used to buy a manufactured home on 5 acres of land in rural Pittsylvania County. Teresa watched that money come in and noticed how quickly it changed their lives. Over the next few months, her focus shifted. She became obsessed with finances, talking about insurance, debts, and inheritance. Friends and relatives would later recall that Teresa began asking questions that made them uncomfortable, like who would get the money if something happened to Julian? Then, in August 2002, Julian's younger son, Charles, a U.S. Army reservist preparing to deploy to Iraq, took out a $250,000 life insurance policy. His father, Julian, was listed as the primary beneficiary. Teresa was secondary. That policy would become the foundation for a deadly plan, one that would end in betrayal, bullets, and death. In the fall of 2002, Teresa started hanging around the local Walmart in Danville, a common gathering place in small southern towns. It was there she met two young men who would soon become her partners in murder. Matthew Schallenberger, 21, and Rodney Fuller, 19. Both were aimless drifters, charming, reckless, and drawn to Teresa's attention and money. She began a sexual relationship with both of them. What began as flirtation quickly turned to manipulation. Teresa offered them money, gifts, and promises of shared wealth if they helped her carry out a deadly plan. The target, her husband Julian, and his son Charles. The motive? The $250,000 life insurance policy. In October 2002, Teresa handed the two men $1,200 to buy firearms and ammunition. Their first attempt, ambushing Julian on the road, failed. But Teresa didn't back down. She pushed them to try again. And 1 week later, they did. On the night of October 30th, 2002, Charles came home for a short visit from his Army training in Maryland. He had no idea what was coming. That night, Teresa left the back door unlocked and went to bed. Around 3 a.m., Schallenberger and Fuller slipped inside. Teresa waited in the kitchen while the men crept into the bedrooms. Schallenberger raised his gun and fired several times into the sleeping Julian. Fuller moved down the hallway and blasted Charles with a shotgun. But Charles wasn't dead. As he struggled to breathe, Fuller fired 2 more shots.
In the silence that followed, Teresa did nothing. She waited 45 minutes before calling for help. As her husband lay dying, she reached into his wallet and took out the cash. When the 2 gunmen left, she split $300 with them as payment for the job. When sheriff's deputies arrived, Julian was still barely alive. As they leaned over his bloodied body, he gasped out the words that sealed his wife's fate. "My wife knows who done this to me." Teresa, standing in the same room, told officers a story of a home invasion gone wrong. But the look in her eyes and the inconsistencies in her story raised suspicions instantly. Within days, investigators uncovered the truth. Teresa was caught trying to withdraw $50,000 from Julian's account using a forged check. A search of her home revealed messages between her and Schallenberger, evidence of payment, and details of the insurance policy. She was arrested and charged with capital murder for hire. The police immediately took Teresa Lewis into custody, along with both Matthew Schallenberger and Rodney Fuller. During questioning, Teresa initially maintained her story of the supposed robbery, but investigators could tell she was nervous, her story rehearsed and shaky. When detectives mentioned that Matthew and Rodney were also in custody and talking, Teresa broke down. Within hours, she confessed, not to pulling the trigger, but to orchestrating the entire murder-for-hire plan. She admitted that she'd given the men money, left the door unlocked, and waited for them to carry out the killings while she was home. She told police that she'd done it for the life insurance money. But the more she spoke, the more disturbing the details became. According to Teresa's own confession, she had promised Schallenberger and Fuller a portion of the insurance payout. They were to get $30,000 each once the policies paid out, with Teresa keeping the rest. In total, the combined policies were worth about $250,000, a small fortune in rural Virginia at the time. When investigators pressed her about her relationship with Schallenberger, she described him as her lover, a young man she was in love with. But in his interviews, Schallenberger portrayed himself as the mastermind, describing how Teresa had been desperate for attention and willing to do anything to please him. In his written confession, he said he never truly loved her, only used her. Regardless of who led whom, prosecutors saw a clear pattern. Teresa Lewis had recruited two men, offered them money, unlocked the door, and stood by as her husband and stepson were executed in cold blood. News of the case spread fast across Virginia. It wasn't just another murder for hire. It was a mother figure plotting the deaths of her own family members for greed. Reporters descended on Danville. Locals were stunned that a woman from their community could be involved in something so callous. The small-town gossip turned into national headlines, with the story quickly being labeled the greed-fueled widow case. In November 2002, a grand jury indicted Teresa Lewis on 2 counts of capital murder, one for the killing of her husband and another for conspiring to kill her stepson. She was facing the death penalty. At her trial in Pittsylvania County Circuit Court, prosecutors argued that Teresa was the ringleader, the person who planned the murders, financed them, and enabled them. They said she had coldly calculated every step to collect the insurance money, even using sex as manipulation to control the 2 young men she'd enlisted. The defense, on the other hand, tried to paint Teresa as mentally impaired and easily influenced, someone with limited intelligence, poor judgment, and a dependent personality. Her lawyers claimed she was manipulated by Schallenberger, who they described as a sociopath with a violent streak. Psychological evaluations supported that Teresa had borderline intellectual functioning, with an IQ of about 72, just above the threshold for intellectual disability. Her lawyers argued that this should make her ineligible for the death penalty, citing a U.S. Supreme Court precedent, Atkins v. Virginia, which barred executing people with significant intellectual disabilities. But prosecutors countered that Teresa's low IQ didn't mean she lacked understanding. They highlighted her ability to manage household finances, manipulate multiple relationships, and plan a complex crime. They pointed to how she had purchased the murder weapon, coordinated the timing, and even staged the scene afterwards. Her ability to cover her tracks and lie convincingly, they argued, proved she was fully aware of what she was doing. To many in the courtroom, Teresa Lewis didn't appear childlike or innocent. She appeared composed, calculating, and fully in control. During her trial, the prosecution played her confession tape, a calm, matter-of-fact recounting of how she'd unlocked the door and waited. There was no crying, no emotion. At one point, when asked if she had tried to stop the men or warn her husband, she simply said, "No." The jury didn't need long. In just under 2 hours, they returned a guilty verdict on both counts of capital murder. When the judge later handed down the sentence, the courtroom fell silent. Teresa Lewis was sentenced to death by lethal injection. At that moment, she became the first woman in the Commonwealth of Virginia to be sentenced to death in nearly a century, and the only woman on the state's death row at the time.
Outside the courthouse, reactions were divided. Some people felt the sentence was justified, a message that greed and betrayal of family would not be tolerated. Others felt deeply uncomfortable with executing a woman who, by many accounts, had a childlike mental capacity and had been manipulated by her younger lover. But the courts stood firm. Over the following years, Teresa's defense team filed multiple appeals, arguing that her sentence was unconstitutional and disproportionate. They pointed to the fact that the two men who physically committed the murders, Schallenberger and Fuller, had received life sentences, not death. How, they asked, could the person who didn't pull the trigger face a harsher punishment than the ones who did? In 2003, Schallenberger and Fuller both pleaded guilty and were sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. During his time in prison, Schallenberger began writing letters, and in one of them he claimed that Teresa had been manipulated by him from the start. He described himself as the true instigator, saying that Teresa was not the brains of the operation. These letters later became crucial in the fight to save Teresa's life. Her defense team used them to petition for clemency, arguing that executing her while the men who killed for her lived was unjust. By 2009, Teresa's appeals had reached the U.S. Supreme Court, but every attempt failed. The High Court refused to intervene, leaving her fate in the hands of Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell. As her execution date drew near, public debate reignited. Journalists, church groups, and even celebrities began weighing in. Christian organizations pleaded for mercy, citing her remorse and rehabilitation. The case also gained international attention. Leaders from Europe, including officials from the European Union and even Iranian President Ahmadinejad, criticized the United States for planning to execute a woman with an intellectual disability. Still, Governor McDonnell declined to grant clemency. He stated that, while her IQ score was low, the evidence clearly showed she had been the mastermind of the killings. Teresa Lewis's execution date was set for September 23, 2010. As the date approached, Teresa Lewis spent her last days at the Fluvanna Correctional Center for Women in Troy, Virginia. She became known among the prison staff as polite, cooperative, and deeply religious. Over the years, she had turned to faith, studying the Bible daily and leading small prayer groups inside the facility. Reporters who interviewed her in those final months found a woman transformed, humble, quiet, and resigned to her fate. She spoke often about forgiveness, both for herself and for those who hated her. When asked if she thought she deserved to die, Teresa paused before answering. She said, "I deserve to be punished, but I believe God has forgiven me." Her story continued to divide opinion. Some saw her newfound faith as a desperate attempt for sympathy. Others believed it was genuine redemption. But no one could deny that the woman who once plotted for insurance money now spoke only of repentance and peace. On September 21, 2010, just 2 days before her scheduled execution, her final appeal for clemency was officially denied. The governor's statement was firm. The evidence showed that she was the mastermind of the killings. In a final televised interview that night, Teresa appeared calm, though her voice trembled. She said, "I just want everyone to know that I am so sorry for what I've done. I wish I could take it back. I wish I could change it all." As the hour of her death drew closer, public protests intensified outside the Greensville Correctional Center in Jarrett, Virginia, the same facility where the state's executions were carried out. On the night of September 23, 2010, a crowd of supporters and protesters gathered near the prison gates. Some held candles, others held signs reading "Justice for the Victims." The mood was divided, half praying for her soul, half demanding the sentence be carried out. Inside, at around 8 p.m., Teresa Lewis was escorted from her cell to the death chamber. She wore a light gray sweatsuit and white sneakers. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and she carried a small Bible in her hand. Witnesses later described her as calm, even peaceful, as she entered the chamber and lay down on the gurney. Straps were fastened across her arms and legs. IV lines were inserted into her veins. Through a glass window, family members of her victims, her late husband and stepson, sat watching. Just before the execution began, Teresa was given the chance to make her final statement. Her voice was soft but steady. She said, "I just want everyone to know that I am so sorry for what I've done. I wish I could take it back. I wish I could change it all." Then she turned her head slightly toward her spiritual advisor, smiled faintly, and added, "I'm going to be with Jesus now." At 9 p.m., the warden signaled for the injection to begin. The lethal combination of chemicals, sodium thiopental, pancuronium bromide, and potassium chloride, flowed through the tubes. Within seconds, Teresa's breathing slowed. Her chest rose once, then stilled. At 9:13 p.m., she was pronounced dead.
Teresa Lewis was 41 years old. Outside the prison, word spread quickly. Some cheered, others wept. Reporters broadcast live updates as the execution became official, marking the first woman executed in Virginia in nearly a century, and the 12th in the United States since the reinstatement of capital punishment in 1976. In the hours that followed, reactions flooded social media and news outlets. To some, justice had finally been served. To others, it was another grim reminder of how flawed and unequal the death penalty system could be. What made Teresa's case linger in the public consciousness wasn't just the crime itself, but the uncomfortable question it raised. Should someone with limited intelligence and proven emotional dependency be executed for crimes they did not physically commit? Psychologists later reviewed her records and concluded that Teresa's mental state likely made her more suggestible, more prone to manipulation and poor judgment. But they also agreed that she knew what she was doing, even if she didn't fully grasp the moral weight of it. Schallenberger and Fuller, the men she recruited, remained alive in prison. Ironically, just a year after Teresa's death, Schallenberger took his own life behind bars. In a letter discovered afterward, he admitted that Teresa had been easier to control than he expected. He confessed to playing on her emotions, using affection and promises to get what he wanted. The revelation reignited debate. Critics said the system had executed the most vulnerable participant while sparing the true manipulator, a grim imbalance that to this day many still call unjust. But legally, the matter was closed. The state had fulfilled its sentence. In the years since, the story of Teresa Lewis has become a case study in criminal psychology and the ethics of capital punishment. Law schools, churches, and human rights groups still cite it when discussing the intersection of mental disability, manipulation, and moral responsibility. Her execution also marked a turning point for Virginia. Over the next decade, the state's use of the death penalty declined sharply, and in 2021, Virginia officially abolished capital punishment altogether, the first southern state to do so. When that news broke, reporters revisited Teresa's story once again, noting how her case had left an indelible mark on the state's conscience. For many, she remained a symbol of tragedy, not only for the victims who lost their lives, but for the broken woman who chose a path that ended hers. For others, she was proof that justice, however imperfect, had been served. Regardless of which side one stands on, the name Teresa Lewis continues to echo as one of the most haunting examples of greed, manipulation, and consequence in Virginia's criminal history. Her case forces a question that still divides Americans today. Is the death penalty a fair measure of justice, or simply society's final act of vengeance? If you followed this story until now, consider what you would have done, not just as a juror, but as a human being weighing guilt, mercy, and the irreversible power of the state. Would you have spared her life, or would you have upheld the sentence? Let us know your thoughts below. Your perspective matters, and every comment helps us understand how society views justice today. If you found this story compelling, remember to like this video and share it with someone who follows true crime and death penalty cases. And if you want more deep, factual explorations of the darkest corners of justice, subscribe to Death Row Diaries, where we uncover the real stories behind the world's most chilling executions. Because every case tells a story, and every story leaves a question that justice alone can't answer.